guys have covered so far, and that makes it a little bit difficult because I'm not sure what to assume and what. So if I get into an area that you already have sort of covered, let me know, and so on. I can adapt as we move along. What I want to do is several things today. I want to first give you a little bit of an overview of how people have thought of some of the worst, the most negative implications of different forms of environmental change. The debates there. How people think climate is going to impact this. The large discussion about vulnerabilities and what we do about them. Try to put all this in the context of trends that are sort of unfolding or expected to unfold over the next 50 to 100 years. And then give it some real world flesh by looking at the two areas that are generally considered as most vulnerable to climate stress and climate change over the next century, parts of Africa and much of Asia. And I'll take you to both of them in different ways. So, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask me as I go along. I'm a social scientist, a political scientist, and I focus largely on bad things that happen, violent conflict, and those sorts of problems. I do most of my work in post-conflict countries or conflict countries. So I have a sort of a particular view of the system and so on. There's no doubt that in the areas that I work, people are often badly off for a whole host of reasons. The environmental dimension then is simply, simply one of them. I'm sure you're familiar with the equation that environmental impact it can be linked to the number of people we have, their relative levels of affluence, of what they consume, how they consume, and the technologies that they're using. Almost everybody's in agreement that these human forces, these anthropogenic forces, are driving environmental change at sort of unprecedented scales and at unprecedented speeds. So over the course of humankind's some 2 million year history, we have altered the environment in lots of ways. But in the past couple of 200 years, we have sort of stepped up and are modifying the environment in ways that are really unprecedented. And the big question, or one of the big questions for a social scientist, what does this mean? What does this mean for human society? What does this mean for dealing with a whole lot of social problems? And historically, social scientists, over the past 200 or 300 years, have not looked at the environmental variables in terms of when they've tried to understand something like poverty or war or these sorts of things. They have tended to look at what's taking place within social systems or among social systems, but they have not tended to look at the environmental dimension. This began to change pretty dramatically after the Rio conference, after the Earth Summit in 1992. So all of a sudden people said, well, or at least a subset of social scientists began to say, this scale of change is almost certainly going to manifest itself in opportunities and constraints on social systems that we need to better understand. So we can no longer afford to ignore this or to have a relatively small group of people looking at this. We need to understand how this is happening. And there's sort of two broad views. One group of people, and you may be familiar with the work of Thomas Homer Dixon or people which was popularized very famously in the 1990s by Robert Kaplan, who wrote an article called The Coming Anarchy. And they basically take the position that when you start to look at the scale of environmental change taking place on the planet, and you start to appreciate how quickly this is happening, biodiversity loss, deforestation, coral reef loss, changes in water availability, different forms of water stress. When you start to look at this, and then you look at our institutional responses over the past 20 or 30 years, what you see is a growing gap. The gap is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and these people sort of predict that we are very close to catastrophe, so some sort of global catastrophe, some sort of collapse, that we are simply not doing enough to deal with biodiversity loss, with deforestation, with climate change. And we're setting ourselves up for fairly dramatic types of impacts to to human systems. On the other hand, sort of in direct contrast to these are the optimists who look at, they say, well, humankind is remarkably resilient, remarkably creative. All sorts of interesting little things are taking place. Some big things are taking place. We shouldn't be so alarmed at whether we're going to manage the social effects of deforestation or biodiversity loss or climate change. The scale is, and the pessimists often sort of take the worst case scenarios and popularize them. If we look at the thing more rationally, more soberly, we have lots of reasons to be reasonably optimistic. Our economy is growing well, population is growing well, lots of people are eating better, they're better educated than they were in the past. We have lots of tools in our toolkit for addressing these sort of stresses. And today the debate continues to rage, with some people increasingly pessimistic and anxious about what's going to happen over the next 30, 40, 50 years, and other people considerably less pessimistic. And they're saying, now focus on the economic crisis. Let's focus on that. Let's build a strong economy. If we have a strong economy, we'll be able to deal with a lot of these other problems. Let's focus on, if you're looking at what is going to affect U.S. leadership and the U.S. role in the world over the next 20 years. There's one group of people say that we've got this massive growing debt that we haven't got under control. We've slashed taxes, we've increased spending, we've allowed this mortgage housing situation to get out of control, we've allowed states like California to borrow aggressively, and we've got a collapsing educational system. The elite part of it is still very good, but the rest of it simply is not competitive with the rest of the world. And so our educational system is very, very rocky, and our economy is still strong, but we've moved out of our historic sort of 35% of debt being 35% of gross domestic product to something closer to 65%, and we're headed towards maybe 90, 100% on the current trends. And people are saying at some point, all those people holding US dollars like China are going to maybe decide to cut their losses. They're not going to continue to support our economy through this if we don't show a little bit better management. And for them, if we deal with these things, we'll be well positioned to deal with whatever environmental stresses we face. Other people think this is completely the wrong approach, and we have to be thinking about moving the environment higher up on the agenda. Today, I would say the environment is quite low down on the global agenda. It is not one of the issues that senior diplomats tend to discuss, or actually that senior diplomats tend to be very familiar with. So most discussions that are taking place in the international level or in Washington are not about the environment. There's very few about the environment per se. It's about Iraq, it's about Afghanistan, it's about the US dollar, it's about unemployment, it's about education, it's about healthcare, but it's not about the environment. Are we making a mistake? Are we correct to assume that if we get these other social issues resolved, the environment will become quite a tractable problem? Or should this move up on the agenda? And should this, are the pessimists correct? That the longer we let this be a sort of secondary issue, an issue that we can wait for another few years before we address, as long as we don't really roll up our sleeves on climate change after 2012 and dealing with biodiversity loss, we are suddenly going to be taken by surprise. And in the year 2030 or 2040 or 2050, we're going to see this cascade of catastrophes, diseases and floods and heat waves and fires, and all of a sudden we're going to be overwhelmed. I don't know, but let's look at the sort of negative outcomes that people are talking about. There's been a lot of research in the past 20 years on the way different forms of environmental stress, and all of these forms of environmental stress are susceptible to amplification by climate change. So there's been a lot of research on how these can contribute to high levels of violent conflict. And in fact, quantitative work done by Paul Collier, he was a World Bank economist, he's now a professor at Cambridge, has demonstrated that what correlates strongly with the violence that we're seeing in Sudan or Congo or Sierra Leone or Rwanda or Pakistan or Sri Lanka or Afghanistan is weak governments, grinding poverty, a tough neighborhood to be in, with neighbors who are also not peaceful and you know, easy to cooperate with, and environmental stress. Fast rates of deforestation, water problems, energy shortages, these sorts of things. And where you find that combination, you find civil war, and civil war we know is taking, you know, that's the primary form of war these days, and it's killing millions and millions of people, displacing millions of others. People also look at what happens to the environment during war, and this has been sort of a mixed bag. In some cases, the economy starts to lose productivity. Areas are heavily mined or covered in unexploded ordnance, cluster bombs, these sorts of things. And in some cases, the environment flourishes under those conditions. So war can be fairly good for the environment if it reduces human pressure on it significantly. At the same time, war drives people into marginal environments in order to survive, pushes them often into protected areas, pushes them into swamplands and other areas. It forces them to make hasty decisions to try and quickly capitalize on hardwoods and other things. So they use things unsustainably, and war itself can actually do damage as well. So it's a mixed bag. In some cases, war is quite deadly to the environment. In other cases, if it sort of reduces human pressure, it can actually, the environment might actually do fairly well. Environmental change affects human security in situations that are less than war. And we have a whole scale of how we think about the ways people can be threatened. But, you know, it is threatening to be displaced, whether it's by flood or by conflict or by discrimination or by drought. It is a tough thing to be displaced into another area, away from where your networks are, where your livelihoods are, where your home is. People can, you know, we know that environmental change is closely linked to the outbreak of zoonotic diseases. That zoonotic diseases are largely traced to people being forced to live in more marginal environments where their livestock, their domestic livestock, are exposed to wild animals, allowing the transfer of viruses that hasn't taken place in the past. And then eventually some of these viruses move from their chickens, their dogs, their whatever, their sheep to humans. And it looks like most of our zoonotic diseases have followed that sort of pathway, which has origins in people moving into wetlands, moving into forested areas that people haven't lived in before. We know that environmental change affects development. That without a doubt, development requires things like large amounts of energy, or historically it has required energy and water. And so when these things are affected, development is affected. We've seen a clear increase in disasters. This is partly due to more people. More people translates to more disasters, but it's also due to actually more storms and more floods and more heat waves than occurred in the past. Environmental change can weaken governments. It can weaken governments in all sorts of ways. And one way is simply to divert resources that ought to be used to build roads and build schools, the things that people need in order to develop, into emergency response. And we see many countries trapped in this vicious cycle where another flood takes a whole lot of the government's time and resources and moves them there, and they're operating under a condition of scarcity. And so that means one less school built, one less hospital built, one less road completed, as resources are channeled to save people. And saving people is not a wealth-creating type of investment from a government's perspective. It can also lead to tremendous discontent. I've been to many flood camps in Africa where people were moved in, sort of told, well, we'll be back in 2 months or 3 months to resettle you or to help you rebuild. 6 months passes, a year passes, 18 months passes, they're sitting there saying, where's the government? Where are we going to be resettled? We're still living under plastic sheeting in the middle of nowhere. And the government says, well, actually we don't have any resources. It's a tough situation, but we don't know where to put these people. And diffuse violence. We know that when people are displaced, you can get all sorts of conflicts related to access to energy, access to water, and these types of things. There's also, on the other hand, opportunities for cooperation. Under conditions of environmental change, of scarcity, we've often found people can become quite creative and can start to work together. Today we see in places that were full of animosity only a few years ago. Let's take Sierra Leone and Liberia. They are now looking at the Gola Forest, which connects Sierra Leone and Liberia and was the pathway for the rebels from Liberia into Sierra Leone, is now a peace park, and they're jointly trying to manage it as both countries try and rebuild after 12 years or whatever of very, very violent warfare. So you do get opportunities. People talk about, couldn't we do that in Kashmir? Couldn't we do this in parts of Afghanistan? Couldn't promote cooperation around the environment, get people talking and get people working because they all have an interest in protecting the water or restoring the forest and these sort of things. And there are some areas where, like Antarctica, where we have been very successful in finding a system to encourage cooperation that protects around the idea of protecting the environment. There are other areas like the Arctic where right now people are unsure of how it's going to go because we know as the ice melts for longer and over larger and larger expanses for larger and larger periods of time, it becomes increasingly viable to tap into the enormous natural gas and mineral wealth of the Arctic. And so all of a sudden we see that this area that had been sort of peacefully managed for the past 20 years, now Canada and Russia and the US and Denmark and other countries that are not Arctic countries like China are starting to say, well, who's going to get those resources? And how are they going to be allocated to humankind? And who really has access to them? And what sort of safeguards should we build in a world where we know that things can go disastrously wrong? There are other things that people have looked at under the broad rubric of linking environment to security, national security, global security, human security. One, of course, is the role of the military itself. The US military, for example, is responsible for about 4% of greenhouse gas emissions. And so its impact on the environment is greater than a lot of countries in the world. And people look and they say, this is mostly inefficiency. This is mostly just incredible inefficiency. And so there's a group of people within the US military who are saying, we can change this. We can radically reduce our environmental impact. And there's good reasons for us to do it. Reputational reasons, financial reasons, and so on for us to do this. And so there's an attempt to move in that direction. There's a lot of effort these days on can we develop early warning systems? So can we find indicators out there that will tell us that bad social things are very likely to ensue in the next few months, the next couple of years, the next few years, so that we could then start to take a more proactive role. And we sort of see, okay, when droughts start to last over 18 months or 2 years or whatever, we start to see society, the burden of this, start to impose enormous penalties and society start to fall apart. Can we get that sort of information? It's not easy. It's not easy to be confident and in saying, if we don't take steps now, we're going to have a bigger problem in 6 months or a year. It's not easy to get people to invest in that. So one of the challenges, of course, is to get the world to invest in preventive action. And the world is not very well designed to deal with preventive actions, although the cost of dealing with humanitarian crises is getting higher and higher and higher. And think of it in the United States, where we tend to use tools like the US Marine Corps to help deal with tsunamis and earthquakes and floods. We're taking a very, very expensive approach to helping people. This is about as an expensive group of Americans as you can put into the field at any time. But it's what we have. And so lots of people say, well, either we've got to sort of change that a little bit and get something less expensive that we can send out there to help during these situations, or we've got to try and work a little earlier in the process and see if we can start to apply resources so that the high cost outcomes are less likely. And there's work today that's very popular on this notion of are areas that are prone to conflict or in conflict or just coming out of conflict also more prone to disaster. And it looks like it turns out that there may be a sort of double exposure, that there are parts of the world which are prone to conflict and prone to disaster at levels that are way above the global average. And these areas are particularly of concern to us. Now, I won't talk about some people, of course, don't like are uncomfortable with the ways in which we move science-based evidence of the environment into social analysis and policy discussions. Some people would like it to be mainly a happy thing, where we talk about saving the environment. Some people want it to be mostly a development thing, where we talk about how do we reduce poverty. And other people want to talk about, look, if we don't do this, we are going to be facing displacement and violence and disease and all sorts of unhappy things. So against that background, and this debate has been going on since Rio at least, there were elements of it much earlier. That in fact, we can trace concerns about population growth and resource scarcity and so on back to at least Malthus in the 18th century, and even earlier to people like Rousseau and all the way back to Aristotle and so on. If we look carefully, we can see that people have always been concerned about how too many people might put a stress on the resource base and lead to all sorts of social breakdowns. But it's really after Rio that we get this hard scientific evidence saying, here's the trends in forest cover, here are the trends in biodiversity, here are the trends in climate change. You have good reason to be alarmed about the social implications. And when we look at climate change tends to be seen as an amplifier. It's going to take all those other things, deforestation, biodiversity loss, water problems, that have all sorts of causes. Maybe inefficient use, maybe just too many people using them, maybe too inefficient agricultural forms, poorly planned cities, all these things. Climate change is seen as something that can do two things. It can amplify these, so it can take trends that are already alarming and make them worse. But it can also add a whole new level of problem. These big, sudden floods and sudden storms that may be historically, in other words, when we think of climate change as a statistical pattern of weather that is different from what we've known over the past several hundred years, when we identify it that way. So people will face, on the one hand, things they haven't faced before, severe weather events, levels of flooding, levels of drought that are simply unusual, and therefore that their social institutions are not well prepared to respond to. But these things can also slowly affect other parts of the system. So even if you're not being directly affected by this drought, if it slowly affects agricultural productivity and slowly increases the price of food and slowly puts pressure on people who are poor and slowly leads to nutritional deficits and so on, then you get it amplifying some of the other things that can lead to negative social outcomes. So the probably today the biggest single concern among social scientists is that climate change, through its direct impacts of floods and heat waves and its indirect impacts of reducing agricultural productivity and changing disease curtains and weakening government institutions, has the potential to undermine development on a sort of massive scale. And if we think of development, we think of sort of different regions of the world have developed at different times. So North America developed after, in the sort of 19th century and through the 20th century. Latin America a little bit later, Asia later still. Africa is just sort of taking off now with a sort of with lots of with several years of strong economic growth, and it's starting to build the infrastructure, it's starting to build the educational system, it's starting to get governments that seem to work and so on. But just as it's at that point where maybe Asia was 40 or 50 years ago, when we were, 150 years ago, it may face this additional burden, which pushes it back, which pushes it off course, which means that Africa, much of Africa, may find that the burden of heat waves and floods and these sort of things undermine its development trajectory. And that if we didn't have climate change, much of Africa might follow the pathway that people have seen in in Asia or South America or North America. A sort of steady growth of public health and literacy and income and better, more effective governance institutions providing more and more public goods. We sort of see this around the world. And it may be that Africa is going to face a level of challenges which are considerably greater than any other part of the world has faced. And that in doing so, it's going to be much, much more difficult for it to gain traction and to pull itself out of poverty. And this isn't only Africa. There are also parts of Asia that continue to be under Bangladesh and Pakistan and Nepal and Sri Lanka. Terribly poor countries that and some of them, India, for example. I mean, India has a strong economy in some sense, but it's an economy that is strong in certain sectors for a subset of the population. Much of India remains uneducated and with a very low income. And that may be very difficult to pull that part of India up, or to pull Pakistan up, or Bangladesh under these conditions. And so that's probably the number one concern today, is what do we do if over the next 30, 40, 50 years, the development trajectories of large portions of humankind are suddenly neutralized or sent skidding in the wrong direction? What will we do if there's no hope for getting out of poverty after 20, 30, 40, 50 years for many of these? Or if they start to get worse and worse, more dangerous, more difficult to cope in? What will we do with this enormous pressure of people? We have already 1 billion people who are chronically malnourished, who are living on $1 a day. We have 3 billion people in the world who are living on something in the order of $2 a day. And $2 a day in this economy, in this globalized economy, is a very, think of the average American household earns $46,000. That's the average American household. A long way from $2 a day. And many people would look at the average American household and say, $46,000, how do you survive on that with a family of 3 or 4 in this country? That's not very much money, we would say. Well, most of the world is nowhere close to that amount of income on a regular basis. So that's probably the biggest concern. And when we look at, and it seems ironic, and it's one of those frustrating things for people like Sen and many other observers who look and they say, the vulnerable parts of the world, the areas which are at greatest risk for the sorts of severe climate impacts that people are predicting, are that part of the world which has not yet moved into development, and which arguably has the smallest impact from an environmental perspective on the world. So this is not so it isn't like the great emitters are now looking and saying, wow, we're going to be flooded, and although the US certainly has some problems it has to deal with. But a lot of the problems are concentrated in parts of the world that have not been great emitters of greenhouse gases, that have not been the big modifiers of land and so on. So there's a sort of irony there, because the people being affected first are the least empowered and the least responsible for the problem, but in some ways the easiest to sort of ignore. I suspect that if the first significant effects of climate change were in San Francisco and Los Angeles and New York and Montreal and London and Paris, the world would be thinking a little bit more aggressively of what's going to happen after 2012. But if the first really significant effects are in Sudan and Rwanda and Bangladesh and so on, it's a little bit easier for the world to put this off, sadly. You just look at where the water stress is and where the projected impacts are. What makes these areas so vulnerable? Why are they so vulnerable? Part of it is geography. So, and I should preface this section, which is getting close to the end here. I should preface this by saying that there's a huge debate over what is vulnerability. There's a set of terms: risk, threat, exposure, sensitivity, vulnerability, a set of terms, and there is no universal agreement about how they fit together, what you measure to assess these things, what the relationship is between them. In fact, there's numerous projects around the world of ways of thinking about vulnerability. So this, what I presented here, is sort of a generic way which a lot of people would recognize, but many projects have customized it, modified it. So it's partly exposure, are you in the way? Are you in the way of where an earthquake might happen, where wildfire might take place, where a flood could happen. And if you're not, then that's significant. It's a big difference living in a floodplain or living at the edge of a dry forest and not doing so. What's your sensitivity? What if those things happen? What's likely to happen to your situation? And how do we measure sensitivity? Typically, people think of sensitivity in terms of a set of variables which all sort of suggest that if you're poor and you have less education and you're living with a weak government, you're more sensitive to environmental stresses. And if you're rich and resilient and you have lots of capacity, you're less sensitive. That sort of makes intuitive sense. Is there something that we can look at? There are some things that have floated up, but they tend to be proxies for lots of things. So correlation doesn't, of course, mean causation. We see that where there's low education, people have what we consider high sensitivity to environmental disasters. But low education tends to also mean low income. It tends to mean crowded. It tends to mean a whole bunch. It tends to mean living in a marginal area. It tends to mean a whole lot of things. So that doesn't mean that investing in education would reduce that vulnerability. It just means where we see that, we may see heightened sensitivity. Adaptive capacity, some people think that this is part of the equation. Some people think it's a different thing. It's a separate thing. It depends how you look at it. I think that typically people would say you include adaptive capacity in this type of equation because adaptive capacity is going to allow you to monitor changes over time. So the more adaptive capacity, the more your sensitivity will go down. So once you realize that heat waves are part of your environment now, and you've got to deal with them, and you're sensitive to them, then if you have a lot of adaptive capacity, then you can start to take steps to reduce that. So for the next heat wave, arguably, you'll be less vulnerable. If you don't have much adaptive capacity, yep.
Are those three factors usually weighted equally, or is the exposure component more important in assessing?
You'll see that a lot of people give them equal weight. A lot of the levels of analysis that are taking place now, they're given equal weight. There is not, this is only because this is still a bit of a new science. Because there's no particular compelling argument for why this should be equally weighted. Mm-hmm. But what people are trying to do now is they look at the historical record and they say, how many earthquakes is of 0.4 or of 4 on the Richter scale, and what has this place experienced in the past 100 years? What's and what do scientists say has happened? And then they say, okay, that gives you your exposure level for Los Angeles. How sensitive, how many big buildings are there? How many, road systems are there that could be affected? What's your sensitivity to this? And what's your ability to adapt? What can you do if these things start to? So people have tended to give them equal weight, but there isn't. In other words, that isn't the end of the story. So with a number that you get that gives you vulnerability, and and there's different ways people think about that. But the number is, in some sense, subject of tremendous discussion right now. But these are the sort of things people are looking at. They're looking at historical data for the first set of, it's a sort of cluster of variables. They're looking at social and environmental variables for the second, and they're looking at things like ingenuity and the capacity that you have maybe in your government or in savings and these types of things. What we do know is that in terms of things like exposure, disasters are going up and up. And this is partly linked to more people, but it's also partly linked to the fact that there just seem to be more floods, more heat waves, more severe weather events than in the past. So when you look at climate disasters, you see that they're rising much more steeply than something. Earthquakes are pretty much constant. The level of earthquakes that are taking place is fairly constant, although arguably some people are now living in more, you may have larger numbers of people living in areas that are more vulnerable. But clearly, floods are taking off. And if you look at the areas that are considered highly vulnerable, it is the areas that I'm going to be talking about. Parts of Asia, parts of Africa, and then much of the rest of the world, and this helps us understand the incentive structure from a policy perspective. If you're in Canada, right now, the consequences to your country of not taking aggressive action on climate change are something that you can weigh against the value of oil and gas production in Alberta, and you can say, well, It's not clear yet that the balance is tipped for us. So we're still employing an awful lot of people and building up an awful lot of adaptive capacity by having a strong economy and new layers of technology and putting resources into our educational system. So is it really the time for us to stop? And many people are worried that if you stop, there's going to be this adjustment period as you change your energy mix or close down something. If you're in Bangladesh, you could argue that that point has long been reached. You have already reached that point. If you're in Pakistan, this past summer, Pakistan, massive flooding in China, massive flooding in India, huge wildfires in Russia. We're talking about tens of millions of people being displaced. Pakistan, 20 million displaced, 1 million homes destroyed, 5 million jobs lost. These people are not now thinking well, do we keep this sector going and build up a little more capacity? They're saying, how do we deal with floods? What do we do to deal with floods? Because they are destroying our country. These are sort of self-evident, so I won't go on. But clearly, we know that as a rule, the rich parts of the world are Europe and North America. It's pretty obvious. India is a little bit of a because it's such a small area. This is well over a square kilometer. Population density, again, this helps us to understand a great deal of this sort of stuff. Ultimately, when we look at the global distribution of vulnerability to climate change, this one, what we see is the areas of extreme vulnerability, and I'm going to go into them after the break, are South Asia, China, parts of the Middle East, much of the desert regions of Africa, but also the non-desert regions in the north and south of Africa, a little bit of Central America. These are the areas where the vulnerabilities are acute today. And the concern is that exposure is increasing. We understand that. More severe, more flooding, more heat waves, that sensitivity is probably increasing in much of the world because population growth and is taking place very rapidly in those areas of high vulnerability. And on adaptive capacity, we have definitely mixed views. There's some people thinking we're building capacity globally, and each year we're better off than we were. Our economies tend to be growing, our level of literacy tends to be growing, technologies tend to be improving. So in a sense, we're better off each year, but other people looking at how poorly that's distributed across the planet. With some areas, yes, some areas are if you're in the Netherlands, you're building a lot of capacity. You're experimenting with a lot of things. You've got simulations of just about everything. You've got all sorts of investments taking place. You've got tons of researchers focused on this problem. You have an entire architecture looking at the risks of climate change to the Netherlands. But if you're in Bangladesh, it's not so clear that adaptive capacity is improving very much. What I want to do now is take a break let you have your break, and then we'll look at the two cases and finish with some questions. Barry knows. Yes, so I think it's this thing. Right? And so I'll try and go through this a little more quickly. We still have an hour, so we're not. So I work in two areas. So I should tell you, I work in parts of South Asia, primarily Nepal and Pakistan, and then I work in parts of Africa, Congo, Rwanda, and Sierra Leone. But I've done a number of things on a larger regional basis as well. But I tend to have worked in a small subset, and in arguably the worst off countries in each of these areas. But I've recently done some work on, this should not say South Asia, that's a mistake, it should say Asia. So I want to talk about Asia first and then reduce down a little bit. So that shouldn't say South Asia. So I want to give a bit of an overview of the situation there. And if you look at the situation in Asia from a climate perspective, you have lots of reasons to be concerned. According to the National Disaster Risk Index, the NDRI, this is the part of the world which is most vulnerable to floods, heat waves, fires, earthquakes, tsunamis, severe weather events, every type of natural disaster you can describe. It has Bangladesh is considered the most vulnerable country in the world, but India and China a third of the world's population, are in the top 15, top 12 countries in the world. So this area, so climate change, to the extent that climate change is linked to an increase in the severity or frequency of disasters, climate change is a big concern to there's 4 billion people in Asia. Asia, by the way, what we mean by Asia, I hope maybe I have a map here, but roughly 4 billion people if you don't include the Middle East. And so 2/3 of humankind is living in an area where they're of heightened vulnerability to these things. When you look at I think you went over AR4 with Michael Prather, right? And also this will be all familiar to you, but if you take the averages of those climate models, and the global average is in the range of 2.5 centigrade increase over the next century. So that's the average position. Asia tends to be worse off than the rest of the world. We're talking about much higher increases in South and East Asia, even higher in Central Asia, really, really high in North Asia. So the general message that we get is, if these models are accurate, dry areas are going to be drier, wet areas are going to be wetter, hot areas are going to be hotter. And with those come all sorts of challenges, economic and governance types of challenges, public health types of challenges. What's driving this? All sorts of factors. I mean, obviously, one reason Asia gets so much attention is because even though, as I said earlier, most of Asia, not Afghanistan, but most of Asia has sub-replacement population growth. Even sub-replacement population growth for the next few decades will lead to a net increase in population. So even though it's only growing at 1%, that's 40 million people a year still being added to Asia. And when you take that out, 40 million people a year over the next 40 years, that's 1.6 billion people. So it's a significant number of people, even though, and this is the ironic thing, more and more people in an area where actually they have sub-replacement fertility rates. More and more people, and in many parts of Asia, very hot economies. So if you look at India and China particularly, overall the entire region has doubled GDP in the past 20 years. The growth rate at 3.8%, I mean, it's something we would aspire to in our country now. Very high, and very high, much higher in India and China. And that means, of course, massive amounts of energy consumption. India and China alone are expected to account for about 1/3 of the world's energy consumption. 1/3 of the world's energy consumption over the next 2 decades. And they are building, as everybody knows, I'm sure you were exposed to this, sort of a coal-fired plant every 2 days, I think, in China. 104 nuclear reactors are also being built in China right now. 104. How many do we have in our country?
102.
Yeah, exactly. So they're going to build the equivalent, obviously, roughly the equivalent capacity to what we have. And they're going to do it in the next 2 decades. Nuclear power, in fact, in Asia is on the threshold of potentially taking off, because South Korea, India, China all have small and medium nuclear reactors that they would like to be selling as solutions to energy demands in the developing world. We're uncomfortable with that for a whole lot of reasons, partly safety reasons, but really potential for weaponization and security concerns. However, we're probably fighting a losing battle. In other words, our ability to influence what China and India and South Korea do, especially since they have the support of the UK and France on this. So all those people are sort of saying, we've got an energy need here, and we can't satisfy it solely with coal, so let's start building medium-sized nuclear reactors that can plug into the small grids that a lot of these countries have, and let's start moving in that direction. We're slowly becoming the lone voice against this. And I think as the lone voice, as we've discovered, we don't necessarily get our way anymore. More people, 1.6 billion people, means more food. And so we're in this what we think of as a vicious cycle, where you need more food, So you have to transform more land into agricultural land. Transforming more land into agricultural land typically contributes to climate change because you're reducing carbon storage and you're also releasing gases. That means climate change tends to be linked to reduced agricultural outputs. So now you've got the system where reduced agricultural outputs with population growth means more land modification. So more land modification, more climate change. More climate change, reduced agricultural output. So we're starting to see this circle develop, and we're not really sure how to break free of it. We understand that there's all sorts of, agricultural output is largely a function of soil quality and water availability and sunshine, and we know that we can sort of control some of those things, and we can add efficiency to a lot of those things. But on the scales we're talking about, we don't really know how to get out of this rut. And even on small scales, some countries are still, maybe not so much yet, but more in Africa, still using shifting cultivation to provide food, which means basically cutting down forest cover day after day after day to produce, very expensive food, really, when you think about it. There's what we call the failed state index. The failed state index looks at sort of how well governments perform. And Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, 4 big countries in Asia are at the bottom of this, alongside countries like Congo and Sierra Leone. All countries except for Japan in Asia are in the next layer above the bottom. So basically what we're saying is the governance institutions there are not the most resilient and robust in the planet. They're not on a par, according to this measurement, with the institutions of Canada and the US and Europe. And so, they have fewer degrees of freedom, they can be overwhelmed more easily, and you can see this very clearly, especially in places like Pakistan, where things like the flooding of the past summer really put enormous stress on what the government's able to do. Technology is a mixed bag. On the one hand, we see road going down very quickly in China and India, very quickly, sort of like it did in our country 50 years ago. And that suggests they're preparing for a lot more cars and scooters. And in fact, they are acquiring a lot more cars, buying a lot more cars and scooters. On the other hand, technologies mean, I think China has recently become the world leader in investments in research on renewable energy. So technology cuts both ways. There's technologies that into renewables, technologies that focus on efficiency, technologies that empower and increase adaptive capacity and resilience, and then there are technologies that just mean more rapid levels of land modification, more energy consumption, and so on. When we look at AR4 and other reports, people are saying, well, the likely scenario, the middle scenario, is more hungry, more starving people throughout Asia, and really fairly big numbers, 50 million more in the next decade, all the way up to 250 million more by 2080, because of agricultural gains not keeping up with population growth. Population flows. This has been a historic issue there. Where do you go from Bangladesh? With the sort of 20 million people are moved by the seasonal flooding. 20 million people. 20 million people were moved in Pakistan this year by the flooding. So wildfires, droughts, flooding are moving people in the tens of millions. But they're not all temporary moves either. So it isn't that they move out for 3 weeks and then they're back and everything's fine. They're moving out sometimes permanently. And so now the question is where do they go? Do they move into urban areas? Urban areas are growing very quickly, more quickly than population growth. But the infrastructure in urban areas is expensive and not keeping up with the rate of growth. So you're take an example, Kathmandu in Nepal. 20 years ago, it had 1 million people in it. Today it has 3.5 million in it. That means that they have water about 2 hours a week. They have electricity for most of the city about 2 hours a week. They have constant traffic jams, constant congestion. The roads are constant gridlock. They have almost no waste management, almost no sanitation. So yeah, people have flowed driven by land scarcity and war, they have flowed into the city to what? To overwhelm its infrastructure. And really, I don't think anybody knows, when you look at why Nepal is sort of sitting there simmering, having come out of a war, but no constitution, the Maoists still not disarmed and integrated back into society, a multi-party system which is largely dysfunctional. But all of this is supported and problematized by the harsh reality that there's not enough energy and food and water for the number of people who are flowing into these urban areas. And they don't know what to do about it. They simply don't know what to do about it right now. So Nicholas Stern predicted, and other people have upped this a little bit, 250 million climate refugees during the 21st century. So that just lots and lots of people being displaced by heat waves and floods and droughts and so on. Is that number's a little bit conjured out of thin air, so there isn't a strong empirical basis for it. It's considered to be a sort of back-of-the-envelope calculation made by Norman Myers, when asked to give a figure, and he sort of came up with this, sort of cooked it up. So it might be 50 million, it might be 100 million, it might be 400 million. Nobody really knows. All we know is that probably there's going to be a lot of people moving around into cities and across borders. And it's going to be amplified by climate stress. That's not the only thing drawing them into cities or drawing them off into other countries, but it's going to be a factor. We talked before about diminishing state capacities and the development challenges. These are enormous for Asia, which just with 4 billion people, you need a lot of water and a lot of energy and a lot of food to continue to develop, to continue to move that half of Asia which is still in dire poverty upwards. And all this taking place as we see higher and higher levels of environmental damage, coral reefs across the Asian coast, more and more fires chewing up water systems that are being compromised around the region, wetlands disappearing, and biodiversity loss at 1,000 times its predicted rate. Somebody's online. Now, Ollie Brown is online from, I don't know how to get rid of that. How do I get rid of that? He's online from Sierra Leone, where he is trying to talk a little bit. So the situation in Asia is of tremendous concern, and lots of people are saying, okay, what can we do there? Africa is an area of equal concern, and what I want to do here is take you to a couple of the areas. It's interesting, Sierra Leone. So here's a guy trying to contact me from Sierra Leone, but I've done a lot of work in Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone, as you probably know, had one of the more brutal wars of the past 10 years, 20 years. A very violent war. If anybody saw the movie Blood Diamond with Leonardo DiCaprio, you sort of got a sense of how, but it wasn't just a competition to control diamond fields. That was certainly part of what was going on. It was diamond fields, it was gold, it was hardwoods, it was, a whole lot of things going wrong in an agricultural economy which practices shifting cultivation and simply does not produce enough food to feed itself. So you've got an area, and the trouble with shifting cultivation, here he comes back, how do I get rid of this guy? So we've got somewhere, nobody knows the number, but somewhere around 6.5 million people. Sierra Leone is one of the poorest countries in the world. Up until very recently, it was at the very bottom of the Human Development Index. It has now moved up, but it's still in the bottom 6 or 7 star. The differences are pretty small. It's Congo, it's Haiti, it's Cote d'Ivoire, Central African Republic. They're all terribly poor. Independent for the past 50 years, a very, very brutal 12-year war. And when you look at so I've made 5 trips there as part of the UN peace building forces there, and my role has been to first do the assessment of the environmental situation, to assess what the situation is as they come out of war, what the potential pressures are going to be on the system from climate change and other things, what should be their priorities, and what should they, and then to attract money for it. So that's what I've been doing over the past couple of years there. And when you look at the area, you've got these little mining villages all over the place, which are highly destructive. So there's a lot of everybody. There's not a huge number of people involved in diamond mining, but they leave a very strong imprint on arable land because they dig. Because I don't know if you know about diamond mining, but alluvial diamond mining, basically diamonds come up from deep within the earth in what are called Kimberley pipes, and every once in a while they reach the surface. And if they reach the surface, then you can sift through the gravel and, if you're lucky, actually find diamonds. If they don't reach the surface, you need to drill down to find the pipe, and then that's what they do in South Africa, Canada, and Russia, and so on. But if in Sierra Leone, these pipes had broken through the surface. And so the diamonds were discovered there in the 1930s, and for the past 80 years, people have tried to make a living by, and what they do is they dig through the first layer of soil to a layer of gravel, and then they sift through the gravel looking for diamonds, for free diamonds. And it is tremendously difficult work because they're working with rudimentary equipment, they're dirt poor, there's lots of corruption in the system, it's a tough life. And right now there aren't that many diamonds left that are easy to find. So all the easy diamonds in much of the country have been identified over the past 80 years and mined. And so now people are still deeply invested in searching for diamonds, but they're not having a very high hit rate. So you get a lot of holes. And what they do is they dig the hole, and often it's a fight against the sides of the hole collapsing and water filling the hole before they get to the gravel. And they take the gravel out in basins, and they sort through it looking for diamonds. And if they find a diamond, they sell it and make a few dollars. But they don't fill in the holes, and so there's just hundreds, thousands of these holes across the country. That plus shifting cultivation, where they just burn everything down. And with shifting cultivation, they burn the vegetation. They plant one crop, just one crop. Then they have to burn some more, and so on. That takes about 7 years before they can go back to where they got that first crop. So they burn, get a crop, move, burn, get a crop, move. And the trouble is, there isn't enough land to leave 6/7 of it fallow to recover. So you have basically not enough food being produced. Can they switch out of that? Well, it's probably the least efficient way of producing food on the planet.
Is that lack of fertilizer technology or just poor soil?
Well, it's that they don't. Well, one thing is they haven't had they have not had access to fertilizer. They're starting to use fertilizer, and they're starting to do studies about what the longer term implications will be of moving to fertilized agriculture. But they're just starting to move this way. And a lot of people don't think it's necessarily the best choice for them. That it may be that better water management and different crops and other types of things will produce higher levels of productivity. But probably they'll need some fertilizer. That seems.
Two quick questions. One is, what are their main crops? And two is, do they mainly depend on groundwater or surface water, or where's their main water supply?
So now you do get a long rainy season, right? So from June through, I guess, October. So you do get a long rainy season. They use a lot of groundwater, and so one of the big problems there is that as population pressures seem to have tapped out a lot of the groundwater, so that the groundwater, they're running out of groundwater before the rain comes. So the gap between when the wells go dry and when the rain comes seems to be getting longer and longer. We're not 100% sure why that is. It's hard to say that that's climate change, but it's consistent with what one might expect with changes in the onset of rains and so on. Some people think that the rains are starting later. They don't have very good data, local data, for a lot of this sort of stuff. So it has to be pieced together, but from larger satellite types of data over the years. Like many African countries that went through an extended period of war, most of them stopped collecting weather data and so they may have a 20 or 30 year gap in weather data. I know, for example, Rwanda had just one weather station collecting data since 1994. They had none during this period. So you get the broad looks, but you don't necessarily get the other thing, of course, is that a lot of their water infrastructure was actually destroyed during the war. So a lot of their irrigation systems were destroyed during the war, and those have not yet been rebuilt for the most part. So you have water infrastructure destroyed, maybe some changes in the onset of the rainy season, probably population pressures, putting too much pressure on groundwater, a combination of bad things. We also know that water is being diverted into urban areas, and deforestation in the hilly areas is affecting water basins. So we've got a bunch of things all leading to negative outcomes in terms of that variable into agricultural outputs. So typical, you can see how, water hits the street and runs off along with all the trash and so on. This is very typical. You get a lot of villages which are now unable to succeed agriculturally and unable to succeed as mining villages, so they're sort of lost at what to do. They don't really know how to the mining is not related to climate change, the agriculture. Agriculture is partly related to the number of people. It's also partly related to a general perception that mining is more lucrative. So young people tend to want to try their hand at mining rather than try their hand at farming or fishing. And the fisheries industry there seems to be underinvested in. Here's a diamond mine. Oh, so here's some images of a diamond mine, so you can see exactly what they look like. And so they're upsetting the water system, they're upsetting the agricultural land, they're not producing much wealth. This will be 3 teams of people working. None of them have a license to work, so they're working under somebody else who has rented them the equipment and has got in principle, has got a license to that area of land, maybe. And so, I spent a day with these guys. They didn't find anything, and I think most days they don't find anything. So it's a tough life, and here they are trying to get to the layer of gravel before the water becomes too much for them to manage. They got some gravel there. There's also, to make ends meet here, you have a lot of things like quarrying taking place in the protected areas. So the land cover is being altered very, very quickly, not just from mining and, although this is a form of mining, so through mining and agriculture. You get this, it's unbelievable how quickly land modification can take place, driven by sort of poverty in these ways which become very hard to repair, but then have impacts on the resilience of the ecosystems, on the hydrological system and so on. This is what shifting cultivation looks like. And these people have moved their shifting cultivation into a protected area. One of the things that happened in Sierra Leone was during the war, the rebel forces, the RUF, the Revolutionary United Front, which was trying to unseat the government, its strategy was to terrorize villages. So they would go in, they'd take 2 or 3 people, they'd cut off their arms or their lips or eyes or noses or something like that, and they'd sort of say, okay, so they'd take 2 or 3 people and they'd sort of publicly mutilate them, and then they would say to the village, if we have any sense that you're supporting the government, we will be back. So this is a warning to you that you are now part of us. And it was very terrifying for people because these were pretty defenseless villages. So the people would often move into the forest area. There was this general sense that if you could get a kilometer or 2, a mile or 2 into the forested area, the rebels would not get you. So they moved into all the protected areas, lived there for a decade, which pretty much destroyed their forest cover. So forest cover there is really just, a symbolic thing. It's 3 or 4% of what it was originally 150 years ago. And people, but people got into the practice, and this is one of the challenges of war areas, is people get into coping strategies. So during the war, all the rules are off. You do what you have to do to survive. But when the war ends, you often just simply cannot return to where you were for all sorts of reasons. Plantations are destroyed, water infrastructure is destroyed, roads are destroyed. So you continue to do what you're doing. You continue to take your toll on the forest. You continue to cope the way you can. And it becomes very hard for a government. Look at Rwanda. At the end of the war in Rwanda, 2 million people came into the country, came back to the country. 2 million refugees. And the government couldn't stop them, couldn't turn them away. So it settled them mainly in national parks and in wetlands. And now you can never recover those national parks or wetlands. Now, the wetlands around Kigali are just a big swamp of industry and farming and malaria, and it's a pretty horrifying place. Because they had to settle 2 million people, and they had to do it in a couple of months, basically, very, very rapidly. And so the national parks were reduced. But when you lose those national parks, you're losing some of your buffer zones. You're losing areas that often, were linked into your water system, or that provided you with some defense against storms or whatever. So they lose all of that, and now, as we'll see shortly, they suffer as they do here. So this is what field research is like, by the way. That's my truck for getting around Sierra Leone, and the roads are very, very bad. So we had to take this little wooden ferry, which was fun because when you drive on the ferry, they say you have to get exactly in the middle, because if it moves into the water and you're not in the middle, it will tip over and you'll lose your truck. Which for us, big deal if you lose the truck in the middle of nowhere. But we didn't. Rwanda, I'm sure you know the facts about Rwanda, another incredibly poor country that went through a massive war. This country farms on the steepest hillsides in the world, 60-degree. We've measured farms on 60-degree slopes. 60-degree slopes are hard to walk up, let alone to farm on. So the farming this is the land of 1,000 hills. Farming is everywhere. It's an agricultural society, and every inch of land is farmed. There's a little tiny bit of protected area for the mountain gorillas, and little parts of the old national forest system that existed before the war. But basically everything is cultivated. But what we're discovering is that partly, and it's being linked increasingly to climate change, the result is massive soil erosion. So you're getting very, very heavy rainfalls on very steep slopes that have been cultivated, and enormous. Well, so we went here and we measured topsoil erosion for this at the end of this rainy season, and we measured it was half a meter of topsoil off those hills into the Nile, which goes down and then disappears, forever. An enormous amount. So some people think that they will not be able to farm there in the next 10 or 20 years. So they've created a situation coming out of war which is highly vulnerable to climate stress. And they don't know what to do about it. They don't know where to go. They don't know what to do. They're trying to transform into a high-tech economy. What we're seeing is when you've lost your forest cover and you have heavy rains, you get flooding. A lot of people, the worst off people I've ever met, and I've been to, I think, 20 refugee camps, and so I've seen a lot of worst off people. But what they call the Twa, or pygmies. Pygmy is sort of a negative term here, but Twa is a sort of negative term there, so I don't know what to use. But anyways, they've got to be with the world's worst off people. So displaced by flood, they own nothing. They live in these flood camps. And this is a common problem where you get these climate-related types of challenges, droughts and floods, moving people. But they don't know what to do with the people. Once they've moved them and they've created this temporary settlement, and you put your people in there, and you've dug your latrines, what do you do? What's the next step? That's where we're seeing the pressures mount in these countries, because as the number of people displaced fill up more and more provisional camps, and then they look and they say, what do we do with these people? And before they can deal with these people, they have another flood, and they're going and setting up the government is setting up another provisional camp. And before they can deal with those people, they're setting up another provisional camp. So you're getting a country more and more dotted with people driven by drought and floods into areas where they cannot survive. So there's nothing you can do here. There's not enough land to do anything there. But there's no jobs for these people. So what happens to them? They become casual laborers, and you know they're relying on almost no water and incredibly unsanitary conditions. So there's huge disease burdens. I mean, I went to the latrine there, believe me. A very, very, very welcoming environment for viruses and bacteria. The road systems are tough. Here's a refugee camp, and you can see refugee camps around the world. And today people are starting to say, you know, flood camps, drought camps, disaster camps, refugee camps. They're starting to become a sort of shared problem because you're getting large numbers of people living in. So even though the number of political refugees is sort of declining, the number of actual people living in these temporary settlements where they've got no prospects for much education, employment, and where they're constantly living in uncertainty, this is growing. And the idea is that climate change will grow this number of people. And if we end up with 100 million or 200 million people living in these conditions over the next 40 or 50 years, what will we do? Ignore them? These are tough places to live, I can tell you. So what the people do to survive, because they all face a chronic food deficit. There's about a gap of and if you look at people living in camps, about 20% of their basic needs are unmet today. So that means that they're not getting enough beans and rice and firewood and oil and sugar and salt to survive. And that number we don't see any way that number can get reduced if the number of people in these camps keeps increasing. So they go out and they work as casual laborers where they're heavily exploited. Here you can make, you're paid by the amount of weight, these are potatoes, that you take from these fields, which are way up in the mountains, you take them down to the road system. And so a healthy guy will carry 200 pounds. And it might be about, and a lot of these trips take 4 hours. So it takes about 2 hours to walk up, and then another 2 hours to walk down with your load. And so somebody who's young and healthy might make 2 trips in a day and get paid about $2 or $3. So and it's backbreak. It's obviously unsustainable. You can't do this for very long. But you get more and more of these people pushed by floods and pushed by droughts into conditions where they're trying to do anything they can to cope. And so, while we're not seeing the effects of climate change dramatically here, or we talk about it as an abstraction, wildfires and stuff like that affect a small number of people, and they seem eminently manageable. Out there, these climate-related social dislocations and problems are more and more visible, and it's more and more obvious when you drive around these places. The things. Congo is another area where I've done a lot of work, and I work exclusively in one area. That's the area that borders Rwanda, famous for the mountain gorillas, possibly, but also famous because that's where the rebels, that's where the people who caused the genocide moved across the border after the genocide. So they live in big camps. But this area, which is one of the most disaster-prone parts of the world, it has an active volcano, it has a methane-filled lake, side by side. So when the volcano erupted in 2003, it covered the village of Goma in 6 feet of lava. So when you go to Goma today, it's still covered. So you have natural disasters there, and there's a big concern that the methane lake, that a methane release might be linked to global warming. So that the lake warms, somebody will think that if the lake warms another degree, this methane could be dislodged. The models suggest that it would kill 2 million people if it bursts out of the lake. 2 million people.
Could you explain how it stores the methane?
What's that?
Like, could you briefly explain how the lake stores the methane?
So you have the methane is, I think it's about 70 feet under the water surface. Okay, and this has to do with the density of the water and its ability to keep that gas locked under the surface. And so some people hypothesize, and so every once in a while, a methane bubble breaks free. So you've got this layer of gas, sort of, it's actually like, oops, better not touch this thing, right? I'm gonna touch. So I don't want to touch this thing. But you've got a layer of gas and then water on both sides. And every once in a while, a bubble of gas breaks up through the surface. Some people are worried that what if the lake warms, could this whole layer shift upwards suddenly and sort of explode into the atmosphere? And I don't know if that's very likely or not, but I think there are models that suggest that warming could lead to that result. So these are some of the rebels. But this is a typical camp. So what you see is these camps. So people move, whether it's by war, by drought or flooding, into these camps. And to survive, in most camps, the only strategy for survival is to go out and get whatever resources you can. And the easiest resources to get for most people are in protected areas, because there aren't people there. So you cannot just go into somebody's village and start taking their water. You can't go into their village and start taking food from their farms. What you can do is go into protected areas. And so these people here, 500,000 refugees here, get their resources primarily from what are called Virunga National Park or Volcanoes National Park. That's the habitat not just of the mountain gorilla, it's the habitat of elephants, rhinoceroses, all those sorts of things. And so we've seen those big charismatic megafauna decline rapidly in numbers. We've also seen, because what do? They go in there and they burn down hardwoods for charcoal, because they're trying to survive. So they're not trying to get the maximum value out of hardwood, they're trying to turn it into charcoal so they can cook their food that day. And a lot of food that you get in camps requires an enormous amount of energy to prepare, because it's rice and beans. So they have to use a lot of energy to prepare. They have to get that energy from somewhere. They can't get it from where people live, so they get it. And so that means that and then you have a humanitarian crisis. You've got these people who, if you deny them access to the protected area, they are not going to survive. If you allow them access to the protected area, then they will destroy it in a very short time, and you will lose ecosystems, buffers, water basins, biodiversity, and all those things. So you can see the tough decisions that they have to make in these areas. What do they do? Do they sacrifice the people, or do they sacrifice the land? And that's why we have conflicts in these areas, because conservationists will come in and they'll say, if you let these people live for the next 6 months on this, it'll be destroyed, it'll be gone, and it'll impose hardship on the society forever. And then you have Doctors Without Borders and Mercy Corps coming in and saying, if they don't get water and fish protein, they will die. So we're going in, and we're going to help them in. And you actually get these guys, they're building the latrines, they're setting up the tent cities in these areas. And it's very difficult to manage. And so one of the concerns is that if you have more and more of these people displaced by droughts and floods, and they go into urban areas like Kathmandu and overwhelm the system, or they go into protected areas and they put an end to those vital stocks of environmental goods that those places have. Because the toll they can take in a short time by inefficient use is enormous. Just forest cover you can actually watch forest cover disappear. Every time I go there, I take photographs. The photographs are all marked by GPS and then put into a UN database so that we can monitor progress. And you can actually see the toll that displaced peoples take on an environment because they have no other choice and because they don't have the means to operate sustainably. This is the lava, by the way. The lava is still there, but the nice thing about lava is not very good for very much, but they do use it for like walls. They can't use it for roads because it's too crumbly, but they use it for walls and stuff. But it makes Goma sort of a crazy city to live in. I talked about the tensions. This is the protected area, the national park, and these guys. So we went out and worked with these guys. They're set up there to try and keep the refugees out. But they know, first of all, they're making $30 a month when they get paid. So their incentive to keep a lot of people out is pretty low. Secondly, those are their families. A lot of them are it's their own people that they're trying to keep out. So it creates a tension for them because they know these people are starving. So this is a charcoal checkpoint. And what they do is that these things come through with charcoal, and they're supposed to determine whether the charcoal was made using illegal woods in the forest or whether it actually came from some other distance place using legal woods. So they take it out and they smell it and they look at it and stuff like this and they ask the people. And most of the time it goes through as, oh, it didn't come from this forest. But then when you go into the forest, you see these smoldering sites everywhere where people are working, burning down hardwoods to create charcoal. And so we can see these and here's another interesting, this is Vishumi, one of 14 fishing villages. 11 of these fishing villages are illegal villages on the lake where displaced people have set up in order to survive. The result is that the lake is almost completely empty of protein now. So it is so heavily overfished that it's almost a dead lake. So you have waste going in there, you have protein coming out, you have forest cover disappearing. And one of the concerns is that climate change is just aggravating these cycles. So against the good things, the high economic growth rates, the investments in nuclear technology, and all, you have these areas of concern in both Asia and Africa. And one question is, what's going to win? Is it going to be, the adaptation and innovation, and they're going to find solutions, or as the optimists sort of hope, or as the pessimists think, are we going to see that at a certain point the decline in forest cover and the disruption of hydrological systems and biodiversity loss and unplanned urban growth simply become overwhelming, and the government can't handle it anymore, and the economy can't grow from it anymore, and it sort of collapses into more and more disease, more and more poverty, more and more people searching for a way out, doing whatever they need to cope. I think that what actually happens over the next 30, 40, 50 years is going to depend in larger measure on the decisions we decide to make here and there on the climate front, the natural resource front, and whether we can move towards solutions that build resilience and build adaptation and find more efficient ways of doing things, or whether we just allow those problems to fester in Africa and Asia and hope that, that in 20 or 30 years they won't have grown to a level where they're no longer manageable. And I think that right now we're sort of tending on the side of not doing very much and sort of hoping that the problems are not as severe as some people think. And the question for you folks, I guess, is how high on the policy agenda should this be? How much public investment should this set of problems command? How can we have win-win situations where we're not neglecting our economic crisis or educational crisis or healthcare stresses, but we're finding ways to ideally reduce the burdens on the environment while at the same time, making some progress on these other things here and in the rest of the world. That seems to me to be the big challenge today, whether we can find win-win situations or whether we have to make choices between them. And if we make choices between them, how are we going to overcome the incredible skewed incentive structure which favors choices that provide very quick and immediate results? Get people back to work, deal with the banking crisis, rather than things that might take 20, 30, 40 years before we start to see the real benefits of transformation in energy and so on. So I think that's about, so that's about all I wanted to show you, to give you a sort of overview of some of what your generation is up against over the next. See, the nice thing is that you could think of it this way. You've got the choices are going to be made by your generation, and either 50 or 60 years from now we'll be looking and say, well, we dodged that bullet, we're doing pretty well. development is continuing on, if we're managing risk, climate risk effectively, or you're going to be sitting there saying, how did this happen? as the world collapses around you. Thanks. So I'll sit down and we can spend the last 10 or 15 minutes talking if you want.